You zip your coat before stepping outside. Hook 2 grocery bags over your fingers and start up the hill toward home. The handles pull into your skin as the bags swing against your legs. Your breath gets louder and warmth gathers under the collar. Halfway up, sweat begins at the center of your back. You lower one bag, tug the zipper open, and feel cool air slide across your shirt. The coat felt right at the bottom of the hill. A minute later, it is holding more warmth than you want. The temperature outside has barely changed. Your muscles have increased their heat production and the layer around them has stayed closed. You adjust it and continue walking. Nothing has gone wrong. The coat is slowing the movement of heat away from the body. Its fabric matters, but much of the insulation comes from air held near the skin. When that air remains relatively still, warmth leaves more slowly than it would from exposed skin. Fit changes the result. Open edges allow warmed air to escape and cooler air to replace it. A covering pulled tightly against the body can reduce the insulating air it holds. Wind motion and damp material alter the rate again, which is why the same coat can feel comfortable while standing stifling during hard work, and inadequate after sweat begins to cool. Human physiology makes this balancing act especially important. Your ancestors had the same general combination seen in people, now dense networks of eccrine sweat glands and relatively little visible body fur. Sweating is highly effective for releasing heat during exertion. Fine body hair offers much less cold insulation than a dense mammalian coat. Material laid over the body can compensate for that exposure by controlling airflow near the skin. The earliest useful covering still had to stay in place, permit movement, and remain workable as the wearer's activity changed. Ahidi across the shoulders and a fitted garment solve different versions of that problem. The first examples are difficult to recover because skin sinew and plant fiber usually decay. Archaeologists more often find durable objects that worked those materials, scraping tools, piercing implements, needles, or surfaces marked during repeated production. Such finds establish capability more securely than they establish the exact object being made. A bone fragment found at Conyers preserves groups of puncture marks. Researchers compared the pattern with experimental leather punching and concluded that the surface had been used repeatedly while hide was pierced. One line of punctures is consistent with producing a seam. The bone is useful here because the missing leather left a repeated action behind. During the experiments, points were driven through leather against a bone support. Repetition produced clusters and lines of damage that could be compared with the archaeological surface. The result identifies a leatherworking procedure without requiring the leather itself to survive. An AWL and an eyed needle perform related jobs in different ways. One AWL can create holes in hide after which cord or another binding material can be passed through. An eyed needle carries thread through the material as it moves, allowing controlled stitching through a prepared opening or softer material. Some bone AWLs appear earlier in the archaeological record than surviving eyed needles, so the needle eye cannot serve as the beginning of fitted clothing. At the same time, neither tool identifies every finished product. Pierced and sewn materials could become garments, bags, bedding, or containers. Conyers demonstrates systematic leather punching. It does not preserve the seam or reveal what the joined leather became. The distinction matters because loose coverage and shaped clothing offer different levels of control. Ahide can be wrapped, tied, or held. Joined pieces can follow the shoulders, leave room at an elbow, close a gap, and be reopened when an edge tears. Archaeology shows that people possess techniques capable of making those adjustments, although the earliest garments themselves remain mostly absent. The following scene is a plausible reconstruction rather than a recorded event. A person preparing for an ordinary crossing of exposed ground lifts a hide covering from a support near a hearth. The side facing the warmth feels dry. Along one edge, a tie has begun to pull through its hole. The damaged point is reinforced before departure. When the covering settles across the shoulders, its front edges overlap while the arms remain free. The fastening method, garment shape, and individual actions are invented for the scene. Hide processing and piercing are supported archaeologically. This particular garment is not. As the root rises, the wearer loosens the front. Air moves beneath the hide and the heat produced by climbing escapes more easily. At the crest, the pace slows. Wind presses against the exposed chest, so the covering is drawn closed while the cooling remains manageable. The adjustment occurs before hard shivering or loss of coordination. No storm arrives and the scene does not depend on rescue. Its purpose is limited. A covering becomes more useful when someone can recognize changing exertion and airflow, then alter how the material sits against the body. Archaeology cannot recover that individual's sensations or choices. It supports the availability of hide working and joining techniques, while physiology explains why adjusting coverage would matter. The exact gestures belong to the reconstruction. Another line of evidence comes from human body lice. Unlike head lice, they spend much of their lives in clothing and attach their eggs to garment fibers or seams. A population dependent on clothing requires garments to be worn regularly enough for the insects to feed and reproduce. The insects still reach the skin for blood meals, but their eggs remain on material kept close to the host. That life cycle makes regularly worn clothing biologically different from a hide used briefly and then left behind. Genetic comparisons indicate that clothing lice descended from head lice ancestors deep in human prehistory. Published estimates for the split cover a broad range because they depend on genetic models and their assumptions. They cannot date the first covering, identify its material, or connect it to a particular archaeological population. The inference is narrower and more useful. Habitual clothing existed by the time clothing lice had become established. Fine sewing tools are unnecessary for that conclusion. Regularly worn wraps or other simple coverings could have supported lice long before the surviving record of eyed needles becomes widespread. Habitual clothing left a biological trace. That trace cannot explain the first reason people covered themselves. Thermal protection is strongly relevant where bodies faced sustained cold, especially with limited fur insulation. Coverings could also protect skin from sun or abrasion, and clothing later acquired social uses. The order, overlap, and importance of those functions probably varied among populations and environments. The evidence, therefore, describes several developments rather than one invention moment, and new finds can alter their apparent sequence. Physiology explains the thermal value of coverage. Tools show that hides and other materials could be processed, pierced, and joined. Lice genetics implies repeated use. None of those sources records the thoughts of the first wearer or proves that clothing began everywhere for the same reason. Together, they reveal a practical change in human behavior. Clothing could become a repeatable technique for regulating the air next to the skin as activity and exposure changed. Tools supported construction and repair, while regular use made the associated knowledge worth retaining and sharing. At the top of the hill, you set down the grocery bags to find your keys. Your breathing slows. Sweat cools beneath the open coat, and a light breeze reaches the damp fabric across your back. Standing still has changed the balance again. The coat can reduce the airflow against your skin before the cooling becomes uncomfortable. You pull the zipper up a few inches, pick up the bags, and go inside.